The moment Donna Vittoria Lanza decided I belonged to her was not the moment I expected. It was not the morning she handed me my first assignment. It was not the night in the warehouse when I solved the problem she had circled for 3 weeks. It was not the quiet afternoon she told me, without looking up from her ledger, that I was the sharpest mind she had employed in a decade. It was at the family dinner. It was Dante's hand closing around my wrist. It was Vittoria's chair scraping back toward me, not toward him. Her lap, her arms settling across my ribs. 30 people going absolutely still. Her knife stayed in her hand the entire time. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. 6 months before the family dinner, I came to the Lanza estate to settle a debt that was not mine. My father, Matteo Tavares, had been a small man in a large city's small criminal economy, not organized, not affiliated, just the specific kind of fool who believed that borrowing from the Lanza family was a business arrangement like any other business arrangement, and that the interest was negotiable if you were charming enough. He was charming enough. He was not charming enough. He died at 63 with $300,000 in outstanding principal and a house in New Jersey that was technically already theirs, which they had simply not yet collected. I drove up the coast on a cold Tuesday morning to present my case in person. I had prepared for this the way I prepared for every difficult thing, by accounting for every conceivable version of the outcome and deciding in advance which ones I could survive. I wore the better of my 2 business suits, the charcoal one that had carried me through 2 law firm interviews before I accepted that those firms were not going to accept me. I brought a folder of documentation sorted by date and category. I brought a counteroffer that was reasonable and knew it was reasonable, which meant I had also thought through what I would do when the first number was declined and had worked out my position for the second conversation. I had never met anyone from the Lanza organization directly. My research suggested the estate was managed like a court, with the Donna at its center, and a structure of loyalty and calculated fear radiating outward. What I had not prepared for was Vittoria Lanza herself. I had been shown into her study before I expected to be shown anywhere. I had prepared for a consigliere, possibly, or a functionary who would hear my offer and carry it upward through appropriate channels. Instead, I was in a room that smelled of cedar and old paper, and the specific settled quiet of a space where serious work is done in deliberate silence for years until the silence becomes its own ambient presence. A desk the size of a small dining table. Books that had been read. No hardware, no photographs, no performance of success. On the desk beside the documents, a small glass of water and a knife with a bone handle that she was not using for anything, simply keeping close, the way some people keep a pen. She was 40 years old. She was reading when I came in, and she did not look up immediately, which I recognized as neither rudeness nor power play but simply the continuation of something she was finishing before she moved on to me. When she did look up, the assessment happened in approximately 3 seconds. I could feel it the way you feel the recording of a room, and then it was done, and she had filed whatever she had found, and she gestured at the chair across from her. "Sit down, Miss Tavares," she said. Her voice was quiet, unhurried, the particular quietness of a woman who had learned, many years ago, that raising your voice was for people who needed to prove something, and that she had already proved everything that needed proving. I sat. I placed my folder on the desk. I said, "I am here to discuss the outstanding debt associated with my late father's account with your organization." She looked at the folder without touching it. Then she looked at me. "I know why you are here," she said. "I read your file before this meeting." "I had not known there was a file," I said. "Then you know the counteroffer I have prepared." "I know what you think you are offering," she said. "I am not interested in the property." I kept my face still. The house in New Jersey was my primary leverage. Properly appraised, it covered 60% of the outstanding principal. "The property is not the offer," she said. "I have enough property. What I am interested in is the person who drove 2 hours on a Tuesday morning in a good suit to present a counteroffer on a debt she did not personally incur." She picked up the glass of water and set it down again. The knife did not move. She said, "You researched the debt before you came. The documentation is organized by date and type. The counteroffer is reasonable, and you know it is reasonable. Which means you came prepared not just to offer, but to negotiate, which means you have already thought through what happens when I decline the first number, and you have worked out your position for the second conversation. I said nothing. She said, "Your father was not a particularly interesting man." I said, "I know." She said, "You appear to be something different." I said, "I am not going to work for you." She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth, a single millimeter, barely registered, already gone. I had never noticed a millimeter before. I would notice every one of hers. She said, "I have not asked you to." She offered me the position 3 days later through Giulia Ferrara, her consigliere, who appeared at my apartment in Newark with a formal written offer and the warm, grounded composure of a woman who had delivered difficult news and good news and every calibration between for 30 years and knew the weight of each one before she set it down. Giulia was 57 and wore her gray hair loose and moved through spaces as though she had been in all of them before, which I would later understand was essentially true. The offer was specific. A position inside the family's financial operations not as a bookkeeper but as a strategist, someone who could identify structural vulnerabilities before they became problems. The salary was better than either firm had offered me. The debt would be considered settled in full upon acceptance. Giulia sat in my kitchen and drank the coffee I made without being asked. She said, "You have a week to decide." I said, "Why does she want me?" Giulia looked at her cup. She said, "Because she watched someone walk into a room where they had no power and create a negotiating position anyway. That is not common. She finds uncommon things interesting." I said, "Is this dangerous?" Giulia said, "Yes. Everything in our world is dangerous. The question is whether the danger is manageable with intelligence and careful behavior. In your case, I believe it would be." I said, "What happens if I say no?" She said, "Then the debt stands and the house is collected. She is not going to threaten you. That is not her approach to people she respects." I said, "Does she respect me?" Giulia said, "She read your file 3 times. For Vittoria Lanza, that is a declaration." I accepted the position and drove back up the coast on a Friday in November with a single bag and the specific clarity of a woman who has made a decision she understands completely and is not yet sure she can survive. The estate was larger inside than it appeared from the road, which I would come to understand was intentional. It disclosed itself slowly, room by room, like a person who calibrated how much of themselves to show based on what you had already demonstrated you could handle. My room was in the east wing, clean and spare, a window that looked over the north property's tree line. The household staff treated me with correct, professional neutrality, which told me they had been told I was neither a guest nor a domestic arrangement and were waiting to understand what I actually was. Vittoria herself walked me through the organizational structure on my second morning, in the study, with a set of charts she had clearly prepared before I arrived. She was precise. She did not perform any version of warmth, or its opposite. She gave me what I needed to do the work, and told me what the work required, and then went back to the 14 things she had been managing before I arrived. I found, in those first weeks, that working for Donna Vittoria Lanza required the same thing working for any significant and exacting principle required: that you be excellent consistently without needing her to notice that you were. She noticed. She said so rarely. The noticing showed in what she gave you to do next. By the 6-week mark, I understood the following things about her. She managed a criminal organization of several hundred people with the structural precision of a chief executive and the moral economy of someone who had been inside violence long enough to understand exactly how much of it was necessary, and how much of it was waste, and who believed in eliminating waste. She was fair in ways that surprised me, and absolute in ways that did not. The household and the organization both ran on the specific discipline of people who understood that Donna Vittoria's expectations were consistent, and her consequences for failing them were as well, which created a kind of stability that I recognized, despite everything, as a form of safety. She was also, and this was the thing I had not prepared for and could not locate in any organizational chart, the most compelling woman I had ever been required to share a building with. Not only because she was beautiful, though she was, because she was whole. She occupied herself completely, without excess and without apology. She did not perform confidence. She had it the way you have a bone structure, and it showed in everything: the way she walked through spaces, the way she handled conversations that were designed to destabilize her, the way she looked at a problem until the problem became something she had accounted for and could set down. She was the most composed person in every room she entered, and she knew it, and was not invested in whether you knew it. She looked at me the way she looked at problems that interested her. I noticed this at approximately the 5-week mark and spent 3 months refusing to name it, which was a strategy that did not succeed. The family dinner happened on the first Monday of every quarter. It was exactly what it sounded like, and also nothing like what you imagined from the outside. The table seated 30. No one performed formality except Vittoria, whose dress and manner for these evenings was always precise, always deliberate. The food was exceptional. The conversation moved between business and the specific, warm, cautious sociality of people who knew each other through loyalty and debt and shared history rather than ordinary affection, and who had learned to exist comfortably in the space where those things overlapped. I had attended the first 2 family dinners at the far end of the table. I had eaten well and observed everything, and said very little. That had seemed correct. At the third family dinner, Julia placed me 4 seats from Vittoria. I understood this was significant. I sat down in that seat and understood it, and also understood that I was not the only one in the room who had noticed. The dining room was long and warm, lit by candles along the center of the table and wall sconces that cast everything in amber and gold. The table was covered with white linen. The household staff moved through it with the silent efficiency of people who had done this many times and knew the specific choreography required. The smell was roasted meat, and red wine, and garlic, and the specific warm spice scent of the Lanza kitchen, which used recipes that I had been told came from Vittoria's grandmother, and that no member of the household had ever suggested changing. There was also Vittoria herself, somewhere between cedar and something I could not have named, the particular scent of a woman who wore nothing heavy, just the clean, precise trace of something expensive and restrained. She was at the head of the table in a dress the color of dark water, silk, the kind that moves differently from everything else in a room. Her hair was pinned at the base of her neck, every strand controlled. On the table to her right, the knife. The bone-handled knife that I had stopped registering as unusual, the same way I had stopped registering the cedar smell and the amber lamp and every other texture of her world that had become, over 7 months, my world as well. Dante Lanza was seated across from me. He was 44, Vittoria's cousin on her late father's side, and the organization's underboss in practice, though not formally titled. He had been, in my 7 months at the estate, the most consistently hostile presence in my vicinity. Not dramatically hostile, he was too experienced for drama. Specifically hostile, in the precise, patient way that certain men are hostile to women who occupy spaces they believe belong to men, through the withdrawal of acknowledgement, through the language of dismissal dressed as professionalism, through the careful attention he paid to everything I did so that he always had a reason to question it. He had questioned, in 7 months, my methodology, my projection models, my format, my relationship to the estate staff, my parking space, and on one occasion, whether my presence at a particular briefing was necessary. Vittoria had answered that last question by not answering it and simply continuing the briefing without looking at him. At the third family dinner, he was watching me from across the table with the particular steadiness of a man who had made a decision. The first course arrived. Julia was telling me about the harvest from the northern property, which was a legitimate agricultural enterprise that also served other purposes. I was listening and responding and eating the bread, which was warm and impossibly good, and tracking the room the way I always tracked rooms in this world, not anxiously, but completely. Dante said, across the table and not particularly quietly, "You are in the wrong seat." I looked at him. He said, "That is Renata's seat. Has been for 11 years. Renata Calabrese was an underboss's widow. She had not attended a family dinner in 3 years, due to a health situation that was known to everyone at the table. I knew this because I read everything available to me to read. I said, "Renata's seat is at the other table. This seat was assigned to me by Donna Vittoria's office." He picked up his wine. He looked at me over the rim, with the particular slow attention of a man who had decided he was not going to be answered. He said, "You have been here 7 months." "Yes," I said. "Some people are here 7 months and then they are somewhere else," he said. "When she finds something new, to find interesting." Julia, beside me, had gone very still. Not the ordinary stillness of someone eating. The specific stillness of someone deciding whether to intervene or let something complete itself. I said, "I was not hired to be interesting. I was hired because I am useful. Those are different things and we both know it." He leaned forward. He said, more quietly but not quietly enough, "My cousin puts valuable things in rooms and then moves them when she is done with them. The question is not whether you are useful. The question is useful to what?" The table around us had shifted, not silent. These were professionals, and professionals did not signal awareness by stopping their conversations, but quieter, the specific quiet of 30 people being very precise about not turning to look at the same thing. His hand moved. It was fast, the specific fast of a man who moved more quickly than his size implied, and his fingers closed around my wrist where it rested on the table. Not to still me. Not hard enough to hurt. Hard enough to demonstrate that he could. Hard enough to mean exactly what it was meant to mean in a room full of people who would understand the meaning. He said, "You should remember where you sit at this table, and who put you there, and what that means about who can move you." The chair at the head of the table scraped. Not forward, not toward the food. Backward, and then sideways. The scrape of a chair being moved with deliberate precision in a direction that was not the table but was me. Everyone heard it. No one looked. Vittoria did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for Dante or even look at Dante. She moved her chair, and she reached, and she took hold of my arm, not the wrist Dante was holding. The other arm, and she pulled, and I moved. Because you moved when Vittoria Lanza pulled, and then I was in her lap. Her lap. Donna Vittoria Lanza's lap at the head of the family dinner table, with her arm coming across my ribs in one motion and settling there, not clenched, not forceful, simply placed, the way you place a hand on something you are not going to release. Her right hand rested against my hip, and the knife was still in it. She had been cutting something when she moved. The knife had come with her the way it always came with her, and it rested now against the fabric of her dress, blade angled down, held in the easy grip of a woman who had long ago made the knife into an extension of herself. Dante's grip on my wrist was gone. I could not identify when it had released. Somewhere between the scrape of her chair and the landing of my weight in hers, his hand had simply opened. The room was absolutely still. Not the professional quiet of people pretending not to listen. Actual stillness. 30 people not moving, not reaching for wine, not completing a sentence, because Donna Vittoria had made a decision, and the decision had the quality all her decisions had: absolute, complete, requiring no explanation, and inviting no discussion. The knife rested against her thigh. Her arm rested across my ribs. In the candlelight, her face was perfectly arranged. She did not look at Dante. She did not look at me. She looked at the table at large with the even attention of a woman presiding over her table. She said, to the room in general and no one in particular, "The first course is excellent this quarter. Please continue." The room breathed. Conversation resumed, not immediately, not all at once, but in the careful, graduated way of people who understood the tempo that was expected of them. Forks were lifted. Wine was poured. The household staff completed their quiet circuits without varying from their rhythm by a single beat. I sat in Vittoria Lanza's lap and thought with the specific, feverish clarity of a person who has just experienced something for which they have no frame, and understood that I had no frame for this. She was warm. That was the first thing my body processed. Before pride or propriety could offer an opinion, the warmth of a living woman under me. The specific temperature of silk and human heat, and the arm across my ribs that was not armor or ownership, but something I did not have a clean word for. The candlelight was amber. The room smelled of wine and garlic and cedar. Her right hand, the one with the knife, rested still and certain against the silk at her thigh. She spoke twice during the first course. Once to Julia, about the northern property. Once to address a question from one of the capos at the far end, about a shipping arrangement. Her voice did not change. Her body did not change. She sat in her chair as she always sat in her chair, upright, precise, present, and I was simply part of the configuration now, the way the glass of water was part of the configuration, the way the knife was part of the configuration, an element she had decided to include and had not yet decided to remove. At some point during the second course, she used the knife, a piece of lamb on the plate that had been moved to the edge of the table to make room for me. She cut it with the focused efficiency she brought to everything her hands touched, and the motion required her to shift slightly, which shifted me, and the arm across my ribs tightened by exactly 1 degree, not possessively, not demonstratively, just accurately, the calibration of someone adjusting a grip on something they are carrying carefully. Then the knife returned to her thigh. I looked at the table. 30 people eating dinner. At the far end, 2 of the younger associates were talking about something that required gestures. Julia was eating with the composed, deliberate focus of a woman who had suspected something was coming and was now confirming its arrival. Dante was eating. He was doing it with the contained, deliberate efficiency of a man managing a significant internal situation. He looked at his plate. He looked at the man beside him. He did not look at the head of the table. I did not look at him either. The dinner wound through its courses. I ate what was placed before me because refusing to eat in Vittoria Lanza's lap at her own table seemed like a choice with consequences I could not fully assess. The lamb was, in fact, excellent. The wine was the kind of red that cost more than a week of my previous salary. Someone at the far end made a toast and everyone lifted their glasses, including Vittoria, whose arm shifted and then resettled as she raised and lowered her glass without releasing me from the configuration. When the dessert course concluded and the family began to disperse, the efficient, low-ceremony departure of people who understood the rhythm of these evenings, Vittoria lifted her arm from across my ribs. She said quietly, "You can stand." I stood. The absence of contact registered in my body with a clarity I did not know what to do with. I was acutely aware of how I had been held and then how I was not. I stood beside her chair while the room moved around us. Julia passed close, placed one hand briefly on my shoulder, warm, acknowledging, without comment, and continued toward the door. The capos and their deputies and the associates filtered out in the organization's particular pattern of departure, which I had learned to read as carefully as I read everything else about this world. Dante left without speaking to anyone, which Julia, from across the room, clocked with one quiet flicker of her eyes before she continued through the door. When the dining room held only the household staff clearing the table, Vittoria rose. She moved to the tall windows at the room's far end and stood looking at the grounds, which in the evening were a darkness beyond the glass interrupted by the measured lights of the perimeter. The knife was in her hand. It was always in her hand. I said, "You did not have to do that." She said, "I know." The room hummed with the quiet industry of clearing. Crystal on a tray. The specific sound of silver being collected. "Why?" I asked. She turned from the window. She looked at me for a measured moment. The candlelight was lower now, most of the candles guttered, and in what remained, her face was very clear, not soft, but readable in the way it was readable when something had been decided, and the effort of the decision was showing at the edges. "He needed to understand a boundary," she said. "What boundary?" I asked. The knife turned once in her right hand. Slow. The rotation she made when she was thinking through something she had not finished thinking through. "That there are people in this organization," she said, "who are not available for him to touch." I said, "Is that what I am?" Not a question. The tone of a woman who has identified something and is waiting to see whether the identification will be confirmed. She looked at me. "Go to bed, Inez," she said. "It is late." She walked out of the dining room, and the sound of her heels on the stone floor was measured, and even, the same pace she kept in every hallway, the pace of a woman who had decided where she was going and was going there without excess. I stood in the dining room while the staff finished their clearing and thought about the word available and what it did and did not contain, and what a woman who used language with the precision of a surgical instrument had meant by choosing it out of all possible words. I thought about it until the room was empty. Then, I went to bed and did not sleep. The organization recalibrated around me the following morning. This was not announced or discussed. It simply was. The way things in Vittoria's world simply were once she had decided them. People who had previously acknowledged me professionally now acknowledged me differently. Luca, the youngest of the estate's soldiers, who was 22, and had the frank, unguarded transparency of someone who had not yet learned that transparency was expensive in this environment, stopped me in the East Corridor and said, without preamble, "That was something." "What happened at dinner?" "Yes," I said. He said, "Nobody touches Donna Vittoria's people. You know that now." I said, "Dante knows that too?" Luca was quiet for a moment. He said, "Dante will remember it. Whether he accepts what it means is a different conversation. He has been here since before the Donna took the family. He has ideas about how things work." I said, "And how do things work?" Luca said, "They work the way Donna Vittoria says they work." That is the only answer that has ever been correct. He knows it. He just does not like what it means in this particular case. He looked at me with the honest, slightly too open look of someone being more forthcoming than his position technically allowed. He said, "Be careful, not of her. Just there are people who would prefer you to be less present than you are, and some of them have been here longer than you and believe that counts for something." I said, "There have always been people like that. I know how to be careful." He said, "I know. I just wanted you to know that I know too, that I am watching." He was 22 and earnest, and I found, in that moment, that I was genuinely grateful for him. The weeks that followed the family dinner had a different texture to them. Not loudly different. Subtly, specifically different, in the ways that things become different when something has shifted underground, and the surface has not quite caught up to it yet. Vittoria was the same. Perfectly, precisely the same: the 14-hour days, the meticulous decisions, the dry, exact assessments of whatever problem I brought to her desk. She ran the organization, and I supported the running of it, and in that frame, we were exactly what we had always been. What was different was that the frame had acquired new dimensions that we had not discussed, and both of us were aware of. She tracked the small things. My shoulder, which I had been carrying tight for 2 weeks and had not mentioned to anyone, was addressed by the estate physician on a Thursday via a message from Vittoria's office that offered no explanation. I went. The shoulder was treated. When I asked Julia afterward how Vittoria had known, Julia said, without looking up from the document she was reviewing, "She noticed you favoring it in the meeting last Tuesday. I had believed I was concealing it completely." The late evenings in the study were what they had always been, in the practicalities, the lamp, the cedar, the documents spread across the desk, the focused work of two people moving through the business of an organization that did not stop. What was different was the quality of the silence between the work. I had always been aware of her in the room. Now I was aware of us in the room together, which was not the same thing, and navigating the difference required a kind of sustained, careful attention that was starting to cost me something I was not yet willing to name. The knife still turned in her fingers when she was thinking. I still caught myself timing things to the rhythm of that rotation, the way you time your breathing to something else when you are trying to stay regulated. One night in the 3rd week after the dinner, she looked up from a document and said, without context, "I would like you to stay through the year-end review. It is a significant period, and your structural analysis has been the most useful thing this organization has added in the last 2 years." I said, "Of course." She looked back at the document. I said, "Was that a compliment?" She said, "It was an assessment." "They are not the same thing." I said, "They sounded the same." The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. Gone, immediately. She said, "Go back to work, Ines." I went back to work. Vesna Kral arrived on a Wednesday in October, 3 weeks after the dinner. She came from a Croatian organization that had been allied with the Lanzas for a decade through transport and trade arrangements that were mutually profitable and consistently complicated in the way all profitable, complicated arrangements between criminal organizations are. She was 34 years old and traveled with the relaxed alertness of someone who had been negotiating in unfamiliar rooms since her early 20s and had learned to make any room familiar within the first 12 hours. She spoke 4 languages. She wore her hair loose in a way that I registered as a deliberate choice she had decided, in the Lanza estate, not to armor herself the way she would have in her own territory, which was an extension of trust, carefully calibrated to be visible. She read the estate within 48 hours of arriving. By the 3rd morning, when I brought her coffee in the east sitting room before the scheduled conversations with Julia, she looked at me over the rim of her cup with the calm, settled look of a woman who had already drawn her conclusions and was simply confirming them. She said, "How long have you been here?" 7 months, I said. She said, "And how long has it been complicated?" I looked at her. She said, "I am not asking to report anything. I am asking because I have been in enough situations of significant proximity and significant obligation to recognize the shape of it." I said, "The shape of what?" She put the cup down on the table between us. She said, "2 people being very careful with each other in a way that requires sustained energy. I notice the way she moves through a room when you are in it. I notice the way you are when she is not." I said, "She is my employer. This is a professional arrangement." She said, "Yes. I have also had my employer look at me the way she looks at you. I know the difference between a professional assessment and the other kind. I know which one costs more to sustain." I said, "This is a complicated environment." She said, "Every environment is complicated. The question is which complications you are managing openly and which ones you are carrying alone in the dark." She picked up her cup again. She said, "You do not have to say anything. I am not asking you to." She paused, choosing, which was a kind of precision I recognized from a different woman. "I think you should know that it is visible. Not to everyone. To someone paying careful attention. And if I can see it in 3 days, then there are people who have been seeing it for longer who are less neutral about it than I am." I sat with that for the rest of the day. Vesna's week at the estate was productive in the organizational sense and interesting in the personal one. She was sharp and warm and had the quality of someone who had spent enough time in difficult rooms to have entirely shed the need to perform anything. She said what she thought with the flat precision of a woman who had learned that clarity was its own form of respect. On her last evening, she had dinner with Vittoria. I passed the dining room at 8 and heard, through the closed door, the sound of Vittoria laughing, not the dry, contained amusement she permitted in professional settings, but a genuine laugh, open and unguarded, the sound of a woman who had briefly stopped being a donna and was simply a person at a table with someone she trusted. I stood in the corridor for 1 second. Just one. Long enough for the sound to become something I was going to remember. Then I went to the study and worked until 11 and did not think about it. The morning Vesna left, she found me in the east corridor before her car arrived and handed me a card. A European number. Her name. She said, "If you need a neutral party in the coming months, use this." I said, "Why would I need a neutral party?" She said, "Things that have been contained for a long time tend to become uncontainable. The catalyst is usually external. It usually surprises everyone, except the people who were watching carefully." She said it without drama. As a fact, the way facts in this world tended to be stated. She left. The external catalyst arrived 6 weeks later. It had Dante Lanza's fingerprints on every surface, and I found it first. It was in the accounts a specific discrepancy, not large enough to be visible at a glance, exactly the size of something designed to be found only if someone happened to look at the right sequence of numbers at the right time. I was working through a quarterly reconciliation for the northern property. The discrepancy was in a transfer sequence that should have been simple. I pulled the thread carefully. The way you pull a thread when you suspect it leads somewhere larger than it appears, wanting to know what you are looking at before you reveal to anyone that you are looking. Over 3 days of quiet, methodical work, I traced the thread to its source. Dante had been in communication with representatives of the Marchetti organization, the Lanza's oldest rivals, currently pressing on the Eastern Territory for at least 4 months. The communications had been conducted through a series of intermediaries designed to be untraceable. They were not untraceable. The financial trail required patience rather than extraordinary intelligence, and I had both. He was sharing internal intelligence, route patterns, organizational hierarchy below the level he himself occupied, schedule information, the structure of certain protection arrangements, each piece individually deniable, plausibly coincidental. Together, a map. There was also, and this was the piece that made my hands go still on the desk when I found it, a specific reference to my name. In one of the later communications, a reference to the nature of my position at the estate, to what had happened at the family dinner, to what Dante had interpreted that incident to mean about the Donna's state of mind. He was offering me to the Marchettis as a pressure point, specifically, by name, with a detailed account of how the incident at the dinner had revealed what he believed to be a personal investment that could be exploited. He was telling the Lanzas' rivals that Vittoria Lanza had a vulnerability, and that the vulnerability was me. I brought it to Vittoria on a Tuesday evening. I waited until the household had settled into its later quiet, until the eastern wing was still, until it was just the lamp and the cedar, and the documents, and the knife on the desk. I laid the documentation in front of her in the order I had found it. I said, "I found this 3 days ago. I spent the time verifying before I brought it to you." She read it, completely, without rushing. The knife was motionless on the desk while she read, which I had never seen before. The knife always moved when she was thinking. The slow rotation that was her clock, her tell, the one motion she permitted herself. It was completely still. She held the pages, read the pages, set each one down. When she finished, she looked at the desk surface for a moment. Then she said, "You were right to verify before bringing it." I said, "The reference to my name, they are treating my position here as intelligence about you. They think they can leverage you through me." A silence that had weight in it. She said, "I know what they think." She stood. She moved to the window, the same window she had stood at the night of the dinner. The darkness and the perimeter lights and the property stretching beyond the glass. Her back was to me. The knife was in her right hand now, though I had not seen her pick it up. "Ines," she said. "Yes," she said. "I need to deal with Dante." "I know. What are you going to do?" The knife rotated once, just once. "That will require several conversations and some time," she said. "Julia will manage the initial approach. The family will need to be handled carefully. It cannot appear abrupt." She paused. "While I deal with this," she said, "I am going to need you in a different position. Something less visible. Something that takes you out of the direct line of the situation." I looked at her back, the line of her shoulders, the precise arrangement of everything about her that was always precise. I said, "You are going to reassign me." She said, "It is a protection measure." I said, "It is a protection measure that removes me from the estate." She did not answer. I said, "Vittoria." She turned. Her face was composed in the harder way, the way that required more effort, and showed the effort at the corners, if you knew exactly where to look, and by now I knew exactly where to look. "Where?" I asked. She named a location. A property management firm in the city, a legitimate enterprise that served as a clean front for certain financial elements, a reasonable position, good work, completely removed from the political center of what she was managing. I said, "You are moving me out of the estate to protect the organization from being leveraged through my proximity to you." "Yes," she said. I said, "That is the same as accepting Dante's premise. He told them I was a vulnerability, and you are confirming it." A muscle moved in her jaw. I said, "He was wrong about what the dinner meant. You would be right about one thing only, that you cannot separate what you feel from how you manage this situation, and wrong about everything else." She looked at the window. I said, "I have been useful to you. I have been loyal to you. I have not given anyone any reason to doubt either of those things." And you are going to send me somewhere else because your cousin decided to be a coward and sell information about something he does not understand to people who want to use it against you. She said, I know you have been useful and loyal. That is exactly why I need to know you are safe. I said, then protect me here. Deal with Dante. Send a message that removing me from this estate is not going to happen. That is the message that protects the organization. She said, Ines. I said, say it. Say the real reason. Not the protection measure. The actual reason. The room held for a long time. The lamp, the cedar, the perimeter lights visible through the glass. The knife in her right hand, still, the rotation that was her tell not happening, which was its own kind of tell, she said. Because the reference to your name in that document is not wrong. I went still. She said, they are not wrong that you are significant to me. Not in the way they mean it. Not in any way that has ever compromised this organization's operations or my decisions within it. But significant. And the significance is a fact I have been managing inside this building for months, and the management is not clean, and people who are looking for gaps have apparently found the shape of one. I said, what does that mean? She turned to face me fully. In the amber light of the lamp, with the documentation of Dante's betrayal on the desk between us, she looked at me with something in her face that was not composure failing, but composure being deliberately set aside the difference between a wall coming down and a door being opened. She said, it means that moving you to the city is the appropriate response. The one that protects both of us while I handle what needs to be handled. I said, and after? She said, after is a conversation I do not have the right to have with you yet. I said, you are making a decision about my safety and my position without asking me whether I agree with it. You told me in the first month that you asked the relevant people. You said that was how you ran this organization. She said, you are not only a relevant person in this situation. I said, what else am I? The knife was completely still in her hand. The room was completely still around us. She said, go to your room tonight, Inez. In the morning, Julia will bring you the formal notification. I will manage Dante. The organization will be protected. You will be in a position that is safer than this one. I said, you cannot watch it come for me. That is not the organization. That is you. She did not answer. I said, tell me I am wrong. A silence that lasted long enough that it answered the question. She said, good night. I left the study. I walked the long corridor to the east wing, the cedar smell and the old stone and the quiet of the house around me, and I thought about the word significant and the way she had used it, small and sharp and more honest than anything she had said to me in 7 months, and I thought about what it meant that she had said it and then done the same thing anyway. At the door to my room, I stopped. I looked back down the corridor toward the study. The light was still on under the door at the far end. She was still in there, with the documentation and the knife and whatever it cost her to stand at that window and be honest about one thing and afraid about the other. I said, quietly, to the empty corridor and the closed door at the end of it, that is not enough. That is not going to be enough. Then I went into my room, and the door clicked shut behind me, and I stood in the dark and listened to the silence of the estate around me, which was not empty silence but the specific silence of a building full of people managing significant things, and thought about what the morning was going to bring. The study light was on all night. I knew because I did not sleep, and when I looked out my window at 4 a.m, the light at the far end of the east wing visible, if you knew which angle to stand at, was still on. She was still working, or not working, or doing whatever it was that Vittoria Lanza did at 4 a.m, when the decision she had made was sitting across the desk from her, and she was not yet sure if it was the right one. I thought about driving to the city, about accepting the reassignment without argument, about being reasonable, about understanding that her fear for me was its own form of what she would not say, and that sometimes you had to be the person who accepted the form rather than holding out for the thing it pointed to. I thought about Vesna, saying, things that have been contained for a long time tend to become uncontainable. I thought about the arm across my ribs at the dinner table, and the quality of it, not possession, not claim, something older and more careful than either of those things, Something that required a woman who controlled everything to use her body to say the thing her mouth would not say. I was still thinking about it when the sun came up. When the household began its morning sounds. When Julia's quiet knock came at my door just after 7 with a sealed envelope and eyes that were warm and careful and asked nothing because she already knew most of the answers. I took the envelope. I held it. I said, "Julia, does she sleep?" Julia was quiet for a moment. She said, "Less than she should. More than she used to. Before you came." She left me with the envelope and the morning light coming through the east window and the understanding that the conversation was not over. That what had been said in the study the night before was not a conclusion but a beginning, and that the distance between the estate and the city property that Vittoria was trying to put between us was the same distance she had been trying to maintain since at least the night at the family dinner, and that it was not going to hold. Not because I was going to make it not hold. Because she already knew it wouldn't. And the light in her study had been on all night. The reassignment notification was 2 pages. I read it at the kitchen table in the east wing with my coffee going cold beside me and the morning light coming through the window at the angle that told me it was just past 7 and the estate was not yet fully awake. The notification was formal and precise, Julia's language in the framing, though I could identify which decisions were Vittoria's and which were the consigliere's necessary softening of those decisions. The position at the city property management firm was described in careful, neutral terms. Strategic advisory role, salary continuation, organizational resources available, start date, Monday next. Monday next was 5 days away. I folded the notification and set it beside the cold coffee. I looked at the window for a while. The east wing view was the tree line of the northern property, dark green in October, the specific color of a landscape that knows a season is ending and is not arguing with the fact. I had looked at that tree line most mornings for 7 months. I had started to think of it as mine, in the way you claim things you did not purchase through time and attention and the steady accumulation of ordinary mornings. I thought about the light in the study at 4 in the morning. I thought about the word significant, spoken in the amber lamplight, as the last honest thing said between 2 people who had been managing the truth for 7 months and had finally, in the middle of one difficult night, stopped managing it long enough for it to be visible. I thought about going, not because I agreed with the decision, not because I thought the reassignment was the correct response to what Dante had done, but because Vittoria Lanza had been honest with me, finally, at the cost of everything her composure was designed to protect. And the honest thing she had said included the phrase, "I do not have the right to have that conversation yet," and I had understood what yet meant, the way you understand things that are said by people who choose their words with surgical precision. Yet was not never. Yet was not a door closed. I finished the cold coffee. I went to my room and began, methodically, to pack. Julia appeared at my door at 9. She was carrying nothing this time, no envelope, no folder, no professional frame for what she was delivering. She looked at the bag open on my bed and at me standing beside it and she said, simply, "You do not have to leave today." "I know," I said. "I would like to go today." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the bag the way she looked at complicated things steadily, without trying to make them less complicated by looking away. She said, "She will handle this. Dante's situation will be addressed properly." I said, "I know she will handle it. That is not why I am going." Julia said, "Then why?" I said, "Because she was honest with me last night, and she was also wrong, and I need some distance from both of those things before I say the next sentence." Julia absorbed that with the particular composure of a woman who had absorbed many difficult truths in this building and understood that absorption, not deflection, was the only honest response to them. She said, "The city apartment is ready. The firm knows you are coming. You will have full access to the organizational accounts." I said, "Good." She said, "Ines." She paused. "She will not say this herself. Not right now. But I want you to know that what happened at the dinner, what she did, she has not done that. In 11 years, she has not done that for anyone." I held that for a moment. I said, "I know." Julia said, "I wanted you to hear it from someone who was watching." She left. I finished packing. I drove past the study on my way out of the estate. The door was open, she was in there, had clearly been in there all night, was still at the desk with the lamp and the documents and, I assumed, the bone-handled knife, and the amber light, and the specific quality of silence that was Vittoria Lanza's silence when she was working through something that did not have a clean solution. I did not stop. I drove to the city and arrived at the apartment the organization maintained above the property management firm and stood in the living room looking at the furniture, which was good furniture, arranged with the same spare precision as every other Lanza property, and thought about the tree line outside my east wing window and what it was going to look like this time next month when the last of the green was gone. The city apartment smelled of a cleaning product and the particular urban air that comes through windows in October when the heat is not yet on and the street below is carrying everything that streets carry. Not cedar, not old paper. Not the specific settled quiet of a study where serious work is done in deliberate silence for years. I made coffee on the kitchen counter and opened the window and stood with the cup and let the city be what it was. Then I went to work. The city property management firm was a clean operation that served the organization's financial structure in ways that were intricate and required exactly the kind of sustained analytical attention I was good at. I settled into the work within 2 days, which was fast even for me, and understood that the speed of settling was partly competence and partly the specific relief of having one unambiguous thing to do in a period where everything else was unresolved and suspended. The work was good. I found 3 structural inefficiencies in the firm's account management in the first week, corrected 2 of them myself, and sent recommendations for the 3rd to Julia with supporting documentation. Julia replied the same afternoon, "Excellent work, keep going." No mention of the estate. No mention of Vittoria. The professional silence was clean and complete, and exactly what was required. Luca texted on the 4th day. It said, "Only. Things are moving. You are not forgotten." I did not reply right away. I sat with the text for an hour, and then wrote back, "I know. Thank you." He sent a single acknowledgement and did not text again. Julia called on Friday evening. She asked about the account recommendations. She gave me a brief, efficient update on the organizational situation, which included the information that the family council had been convened and that the Dante situation was being formally addressed. She said these things with the professional precision of a woman who was being precise because precision was what the situation required, and who trusted me to understand what was being said without requiring the explicit version. I understood. I said, understood, and meant it. She said, before she hung up. She is managing it. She is doing it correctly. I wanted you to know that. I said, I know she is. A pause. Then, take care of yourself, Inez. The apartment has good light in the mornings. It did. I had noticed. 10 days into the reassignment, the car appeared. It was a dark sedan, parked on the street outside the property management firm, and it would not have registered as unusual except that it was there on a Tuesday afternoon, and again on Wednesday morning, and again Thursday evening, and I had been in this world long enough to understand that a vehicle's presence in those specific patterns was not coincidence. I tracked it, without visibly tracking it. I noted the plate, the model, the specific angle of parking that gave whoever was inside an unobstructed view of both the firm's entrance and the apartment building's side door. I was not afraid. I want to be precise about that. I was not afraid. I was alert in the way that I had been alert every day since I walked up the coast road and into Vittoria Lanza's world, alert in the specific, calibrated way that this world required and that I had learned to sustain without letting it become fear, because fear was expensive and careful attention was free. I called Julia. I described the vehicle. I gave her the plate. I gave her the pattern of appearances. I said, I do not know if this is Marchetti or something unrelated. I wanted to report it. Julia was quiet for a moment. She said, stay in the apartment tonight. Do not go to the firm after dark. I said, Julia, is this from the intelligence Dante passed? She said. I said, how quickly? She said, quickly. She hung up. I went to the apartment. I made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table and read a report that needed reading and did not think about the car on the street with any more energy than the situation warranted. This was the thing that the world had given me, that nothing else had given me in quite the same way. The ability to sit with a dangerous thing and continue functioning with full attention, not by denying the danger but by refusing to give it more space than it had earned. What I had not prepared for was the knock at the apartment door at 11 that night. I had been in bed, not sleeping, reading. The knock was quiet, not a police knock, not an urgent knock, the specific quiet knock of someone who was not sure they had the right to knock and was trying to ask permission in the sound of it. I said, "Who is it?" A pause. Then, "It's me." The voice was Vittoria's. I sat in the bed for 1 second. I put the book down. I got up. She was in the hallway in dark clothes, not the estate clothes, not the Donna's clothes. Dark jeans, a gray coat that was well made and said nothing about her except that whoever wore it had not needed a coat to say anything about them in a very long time. Her hair was down. I had seen her hair down twice before. Both times it had meant something. This was the third time. She was not carrying anything. Not a folder, not a phone, not the bone-handled knife. Her hands were in her coat pockets, and she looked at me from the hallway with the specific expression of a woman who has arrived somewhere she is not certain she is allowed to be, and has decided to arrive anyway. I said, "How did you know about the car?" She said, "Julia called me 20 minutes after you called her." I said, "You drove 2 hours." "Yes," she said. I said, "It is 11 o'clock." She said, "I know what time it is." I stepped back from the door. She came in. The apartment was warm, the kitchen light still on from dinner. The living room in the softer light of the reading lamp I had left on in the bedroom whose door was open. She stood in the apartment and looked at it the way she looked at any space she entered, cataloging, registering, filing. It was a brief assessment. It settled on me. She said, "The vehicle is being handled. You are not in danger tonight." I said, "I know I am not in danger tonight. That is not why you drove 2 hours." She looked at me. I said, "Say it, Vittoria. Whatever you came here to say, not the operational update, the other thing." She crossed the room. She moved past the kitchen table and stopped a few feet from me in the living room, with the reading lamp behind her, casting her face in shadow, and I could see, in whatever light remained, that her face was not doing the composed thing. It was doing something else entirely. Something I had been watching at the edges for 7 months and had never seen in the full. She said, "I made the wrong decision." I said, "Which one?" She said, "Sending you here." The reasoning was correct, the structural reasoning, the organizational logic. The Marchetti situation is real. The vulnerability was real. The need to remove the pressure point was real. All of that was correct. I said, And, she said, "It was also what Dante wanted. You said that the night I told you. You said it, and you were right, and I knew you were right, and I made the decision anyway." I said, "Why?" She looked at the window. The city outside was doing what cities do at 11 on a weeknight, the specific, indifferent noise of a world that is not paying attention to what is happening in this apartment. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked back at me. She said, "Because I have been afraid of this, specifically of this situation, of being in a room with you, without the organization between us, since approximately the night you walked into my study and put a folder on my desk and told me you were not going to work for me." I said, "You remembered that." She said, "I remember everything about you. That has been the problem from the beginning." The apartment was very quiet. I said, "You sent me here to manage the fear." She said, "I sent you here because the decision was professionally defensible, and I used the professional defensibility as a container for the fear, and you were right that those are different things. And I am here because I have been sitting in the study for 10 days with Dante's situation and Julia's management of it, and the full accounting of what I have done and not done in the past 7 months, and the accounting is not something I can keep in the study anymore." "What is the accounting?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The coat was still on. She had not moved to take it off, and I noticed this as the thing that told me how careful she was being. She had not allowed herself the comfort of settling in. She was standing in the middle of my apartment in her coat because she was not going to assume she was staying. She said, I was aware of what I felt for you by November of last year. I made the decision in November that the appropriate response was to be the best version of a professional I could be, to give you everything the position deserved, and to manage everything else inside the confines of the coaching box, so to speak. I held that decision for 7 months. I said, "You held it." She said, "I held it, and the holding required tools that were not always fair to you." The dinner What Happened with Dante and my response to it was the first time the holding broke in a way that was visible. And my response to the visible breaking was to find a way to put distance between us that had a professional justification. Because distance with a justification was the only version of distance I trusted myself to maintain. I looked at her. This woman who had been the most composed person in every room for 11 years and was standing in my apartment at 11 o'clock in a gray coat with her hair down and her hands in her pockets and nothing between us except 10 days of silence and everything that had been accumulating since November. I said, "You were using the clipboard to say things you could not say out loud." "I told you that." She said, "You did. You were right about that too." I said, "And the answer to me telling you that was to send me to the city." She said, "Yes," which was a coward's answer to the right question. I said, "You are not a coward." She looked at me. Something moved in her face, not the millimeter, not the controlled tell I had catalogued for months, something larger, the specific expression of a person being seen accurately in a place they had believed was private. She said, "In most things, no. In this specific thing, for 7 months, yes." I said, "Why are you here right now? Not the car, not the operational concern. Why tonight?" She said, "Because I have been sitting in the study since you left, trying to find the version of this that was still professionally manageable, and there is not one. And at 9 o'clock tonight I got into a car and drove to the city because the thing I have been trying to contain since November has been uncontainable for a very long time, and the only thing I have been doing by containing it is preventing myself from saying what is true." I said, "Then say what is true." She said, "I love you." 3 words. She said them the way she said everything precisely, without excess, without the performance of difficulty, without asking them to be smaller than they were or larger than they were. Just the words, in her quiet, level voice, in my kitchen-lit apartment at 11 on a Thursday night. I stood with them. I said, "Since November." "Since November," she said. "I have loved you since approximately the 3rd week of November, when you stayed in the film room for 2 hours after everyone else had left because you were not satisfied with your read on a specific financial projection and you refused to leave until it was right, and I was walking past on my way out and I stopped and watched you work and understood, clearly and without ambiguity, that I was in significant difficulty." I said, "You watched me work." She said, "I have watched you work many times." That was the time I understood what the watching meant. I said, "And you said nothing for 7 months." "I said nothing," she confirmed. "I managed it instead. And the management was not clean, and it cost you things it should not have cost you." I said, "It cost me a playoff start, metaphorically speaking." The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. In the apartment light, without the amber lamp, or the cedar, or the organizational distance, that millimeter looked different than it ever had in the study or the dining room. It looked like something she was allowing rather than something that escaped her control. She said, "Yes, that is an accurate accounting." I said, "What do you want to happen now?" She said, "I want to tell you the things I have not said. I want to do it honestly, in whatever time you are willing to give me, and I want to know what you need from me. Specifically, as a condition of any version of this that goes forward, because you have the right to name conditions, and I will hear every one of them." I looked at her for a long time. She was 40 years old and the most precise person I had ever encountered, and she was standing in my apartment in a coat she had not taken off because she was not assuming she was welcome to take it off, having driven 2 hours after a 10-day silence to say 3 words that she had been managing, alone, since November. I said, "Take your coat off." She looked at me. I said, "You are not a guest here. You are not required to stand in the middle of my living room in your coat at 11 at night. Take it off and sit down." She took it off. She set it over the back of the kitchen chair with the precise, economical motion she brought to everything, and she sat. I sat across from her. I said, "Here are my conditions." She said, "Yes." I said, "You do not use organizational tools to manage personal situations. If something is happening between us, you do not respond to it with a reassignment or a formal review or a professional justification that is actually about something else. You say what it is. You say it to me directly." She said, "Yes." I said, "You ask me. When you are making decisions that involve me, you ask me. I am not a vulnerability, and I am not a pressure point, and I am not something to be protected from a safe distance. I am a person who has been inside your world for 8 months and has not given anyone any reason to doubt my loyalty or my capability, and I deserve to be treated like the relevant person I am." She said, "Yes." I said, "And you tell me when you are afraid. Not the version you can wrap in organizational language. The actual version. The one you drove 2 hours to say tonight." She said, "That one costs more." "I know," I said. "That is why I am naming it as a condition." She looked at me. In the kitchen light, with her coat on the chair and her hair down and no position between us, she looked her age in a way she did not always look her age, and it was not a diminishment. It was the specific realness of a person who is not currently performing anything, who is simply present in a room with another person and is afraid and is not converting the fear into something more manageable. She said, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can." A silence. The city moved outside. A car somewhere below. The specific ambient noise of a building doing what buildings do at this hour, which is mostly breathe. I said, "I have been in love with you since approximately March." She went still. I said, "The night you told the assistant coaches that my projection model was the most useful analytical work the organization had received in 3 years, and then walked out of the room before I could respond to it." I was standing in the hallway, and the door had just closed, and I thought, with complete clarity, that I was in very significant difficulty. She said, "March?" "March," I said. "So you have 7 months and I have 5, which means we have been in this situation together for most of the working year, and managed it individually, in ways that were not particularly efficient." She said, "No, they were not." I said, "That is a waste of good months." She said, "Yes." I said, "We should not waste any more of them." She looked at me across the kitchen table in the city apartment at 11 at night, and the look was the one I had been cataloging since October, the one I had never had a clean word for, the one that was not professional assessment and not composure and not the controlled attention she brought to every problem she found interesting. The look that had lived, for 7 months, just outside the frame of everything she was professionally allowed. It was not outside the frame anymore. I reached across the table. I touched her jaw first, the way you touch something you have been careful with for a long time and are allowing yourself, finally, to hold. Her skin was warm. Her breath changed not dramatically, just the one sharp intake that is the body's honest response to being touched by the person it has been anticipating for a very long time. I kissed her. It was not frantic. It was worse than frantic, patient, and earned, and exactly as long as it needed to be. Which was long. All the restraint of 7 months, turning into something honest, instead of careful. Her hand found my face, then my shoulder, then settled at my waist with the specificity of someone who had known where they were going and was finally allowed to arrive. When we broke, she rested her forehead against mine. She said, quietly, "That cost me nothing. I want you to know that. After everything it took to get here, this part cost me nothing." I said, "That is the nicest thing you have ever said to me." She said, "I intend to say nicer ones." I said, "I will hold you to that." She stayed. The morning came the way mornings come after long nights, gradually, with the specific light of a city learning that another night was over, the gray-blue that precedes the gold, coming through the apartment windows and doing something useful to every surface it touched. We had talked through most of it. Not always about the serious things, sometimes about the northern property, and sometimes about the specific absurdity of the moment in the firm's accounts that I had been trying to resolve for a week, and once, briefly, and with more humor than I had expected from her, about the expression on Dante's face at the dinner table in the moment before the chair scraped. We had also, at some point in the middle of the night, talked about what came next. Not in terms of logistics, those would require their own conversations in their own time. Just in terms of what was true, that we were two people who had been in the same building for 8 months avoiding the obvious and were now, at approximately 4 in the morning in a city apartment, done avoiding it. That this was the beginning of something that would require honesty from both of us in ways that were still being established. That the condition about saying it directly, about naming it when it was real, and not wrapping it in organizational language, was a condition she intended to hold. She had said, just before the gray light came, "I am going to make mistakes. I have been controlled for a very long time, and the habits of control do not dissolve overnight." I had said, "I know." She had said, "I need you to tell me when I am doing it, the way you told me in the study, not gently." I had said, "That will not be a problem." She had almost smiled. All the way this time, not the millimeter, the whole thing. I had decided, in that moment, that the whole smile was the thing I was going to collect from this point forward. That if the millimeter had kept me awake and cataloging for 7 months, the whole smile was something I could sustain an entire future around. The accountability process within the Lanza organization moved efficiently and without sentiment, which was how Vittoria had always run it and did not stop running it now. The family council convened within 48 hours of her return to the estate. The evidence I had compiled was presented in full: the communications, the intelligence passed, the financial trail, the specific reference to my name, and what it had been offered to represent. Julia managed the presentation. Vittoria sat at the head of the table and let the evidence speak, and did not offer interpretation or justification beyond the documented facts. Dante said nothing useful. He had spent 10 days understanding, with the precision that distinguished intelligent people in this world from unintelligent ones, exactly what had been found and what it meant, and what was going to happen now. He understood all of it. His silence was the silence of a man who had done the accounting and accepted the result. The council made its decision. The organization handled the situation in the way the organization handles such situations, which I did not need to witness and did not witness, and which I understood as a fact of the world I had chosen, and had chosen eyes open, which meant it was not a fact I was permitted to pretend did not exist. Vittoria reported herself to the council immediately after. Not because they would have required it. The question of whether a personal situation between the Donna and an organizational member had affected decisions was not, strictly speaking, the council's jurisdiction, and everyone in that room knew it. She reported herself because she had told me that the honest thing was the only thing. And the honest thing included a formal acknowledgement that she had managed an internal conflict through personal decision-making rather than organizational channels, and that this had created a vulnerability that Dante had exploited. She named it specifically. She named what she had done at the family dinner as a personal response and not a tactical one. She named the reassignment as an attempt to manage the conflict through distance rather than disclosure. She said, in front of the council, "I should have disclosed this earlier. I did not. The consequences of that are on the record." The council accepted the disclosure. There were no formal sanctions, the Donna's position was not under question, and the organizational damage had been contained before it became operational. But the acknowledgement was real and public and cost her something, in the specific currency this world traded in, that was not recoverable. In a world that ran on the perception of control, admitting that your control had been imperfect for 8 months in a personal matter was not a small cost. She paid it without flinching. I was at the city property when Julia called to tell me the council meeting was concluded. Julia said, "It went the way it needed to go." And then she said what needed to be said. In front of everyone. I said, "I know she did." Julia said, "You have been good for her. I want you to know that I have seen her for 11 years, and I have not seen her do that say the true thing in front of the room without armor for any other reason." I said, "She has been good for me too." A pause. Julia said, "I suspected as much, since approximately December." "December," I said. "I didn't think it was visible until the dinner." Julia said, dryly, You are both very confident in how private you were being. I laughed. In the city apartment kitchen, with the October light through the open window, I laughed. And I thought about Vesna saying, in the east sitting room with her coffee, that she had read the estate in 3 days. I thought about Luca saying you are not forgotten. I thought about Julia's hand on my shoulder as she passed at the end of the family dinner, warm and acknowledging, and never once needing to be explained. The people who had been in this building the longest had known in December. I filed that away and appreciated it. I stayed at the city property for another 3 weeks after the council meeting, not because I was required to, because the 3 weeks were useful for the work, which I had genuinely improved in the time I had been there, and for the specific kind of clarity that comes from being in a different space than the one where all the significant things happened. I walked through the city in the November mornings and learned the particular angles at which the light came down between the buildings and the specific sounds of the neighborhood at different hours, and the coffee from the place too. Streets over that was better than anything available at the estate, and which I brought back to the apartment and drank at the kitchen table, where Vittoria had sat across from me and said 3 words. She called every evening, not through Julia herself. The calls were sometimes brief organizational updates, the kind of efficient information exchange she had always been good at, and sometimes were not brief at all. We talked about the northern property harvest and the account structure and what I thought about 3 things she was considering for the coming year, and then we talked about other things, and the other things became the larger portion of the call the further into November we went. She said, on one of those calls, I have been learning the city apartment in the evenings through the call. I know what time the street noise changes. I know what you make for dinner on Tuesdays. I said, that is surveillance. She said, that is attention. You should know the difference by now. I said, you are correct. I know the difference. She said, good night, Enos. I said, good night, Vittoria. At the end of the 3rd week, I drove back up the coast road on a Saturday morning, with the November light doing what November light does on the eastern seaboard, making everything look simultaneously more beautiful and more truthful. The way sharp light always makes things look when it has nothing to soften. The estate appeared through the tree line the way it always appeared, disclosing itself gradually. The way a person calibrates what they show based on what you have already demonstrated you can handle. Julia met me at the entrance. She handed me a coffee and fell into step beside me the way she had, it seemed now, every time I had needed someone to fall into step. She said, the study is yours if you want to work this afternoon. I said, is she in it? Julia said, she will be, as of about 4 o'clock. I said, then I will be in it at 4. Julia said, that is what I assumed. She went to attend to her own mourning. I went to the east wing and opened the window and looked at the tree line, which was fully bare now, November having completed its argument with the landscape while I was in the city, and I looked at it for a while and felt, without trying to name it or manage it or contain it, that I was home. At 4 o'clock I went to the study. She was at the desk with the lamp and the documents and the bone-handled knife on the desk to her right. She looked up when I came in. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at me the way she had looked at me for 8 months, the look that had no professional frame and had never had one, and this time she did not recalibrate it or file it away or pull the organizational distance back across it like a curtain. She looked at me, and the room knew what it was looking at. I sat in the chair across from the desk. I said, what are we working on? She said, year-end organizational review. The northern property projection is missing your analysis from the 3rd quarter. I said, I will have it to you by Thursday. She said, thank you. I said, you're welcome. She went back to the documents. I opened the laptop I had carried in from the east wing. The lamp made the same amber light it always made. The cedar smell was the same cedar smell. The knife turned once, slowly, in her right hand. We worked for 3 hours. Sometimes she asked me something and I answered it. Sometimes I asked her something and she answered it. At 6:30, the household staff sent food to the study without being asked, which had never happened before in the 8 months I had been at the estate, and which meant that someone had left instructions that on certain evenings, the study would require feeding. Julia, I assumed. I would thank her later. We ate at the desk with the documents between us and said very little, and did not need to say very little. the silence was the comfortable kind. The kind that exists between people who have established that their silences are safe, and this one was the first we had been inside together that was not also carrying the weight of everything unsaid. At 8 o'clock she set her pen down and looked at me. She said, "I want to say something." I set the laptop aside. She said, "I have said the important things. I said them in your apartment and they were true and they are still true. What I have not said, what I did not say, because I was not sure I had earned the right to say it at 4 in the morning after 7 months of silence, is that I am sorry." "Specifically," I said. "Tell me specifically," she said. "I used the coaching box. I used the organizational structure and the decisions available to me within that structure to manage something that I should have managed by being honest. The bench, the dinner, the reassignment. Those were decisions I had professional justifications for and used those justifications to avoid saying the honest thing. That was wrong. And what made it specifically wrong was that you saw it. You named it. You told me exactly what I was doing and I did not stop doing it." I said, "No. You didn't." She said, "No, I didn't. I am sorry for that. Not in the general sense. For the specific cost of it to you." I looked at her. The lamp. The knife still on the desk. Her face doing the open, unarmored thing that I had first seen at the dinner table and had been seeing in increments ever since. I said, "I accept that." She said, "You don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to. I am choosing to." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to keep doing what you have been doing since the city. Calling in the evenings, telling me the things that are not organizational. Being in a room with me without the frame." She said, "That I can do." I said, "I need the knife to stop being the only tell. I need the other ones, the ones you have been keeping back." She said, "That is going to take practice." I said, "I know. I will be patient." She said, "You have been remarkably patient already." I said, "I have been paying attention. That is different from patient." The corner of her mouth, all the way, the full thing. She said, "Come around the desk." I came around the desk. She pushed the chair back to make room and I sat on the edge of the desk beside her, and she turned to face me, and there was no table between us and no organizational frame and no professional distance being maintained by either party, just the lamp and the cedar and the knife on the desk and the full accounting of everything we had each been carrying since November. She reached up. She touched my face the way you touch something you have been keeping careful for a long time and are finally allowing yourself to hold properly. Her palm was warm against my jaw. I leaned into it without deciding to, the way you lean into warmth without deciding to, because deciding is not always what happens. She kissed me the way she did everything with complete attention, without excess, precisely, nothing frantic. The patience of 7 months turning into something specific and warm, and exactly what it was. Her other hand settled at my waist, not a claim, not a hold, just the specific weight of someone who has arrived at the place they were going, and is not going anywhere else. When she pulled back, she looked at me for a long moment. She said, "For the record, I was aware of this before March." I said, "When?" She said, "January." I stared at her. She said, "The night you told me that the third quarter projection model I had been using was structurally flawed in its risk assessment, and you were correct, and I had to sit with the fact that you were correct for 20 minutes before I could address it." I said, "That was January." She said, "You were correct about something I had built myself, and you told me so directly without softening it, and I sat at that desk after you left and thought, with complete clarity, that I was going to have a very difficult year." I said, "January. You had 7 months." She said, "Yes." I said, "I had 5. You had a 2-month head start." She said, "I did." I said, "I want those 2 months back." She looked at me. The full smile again, the one I had decided I was going to collect. It was different from this close. Every part of it was different from this close. She said, "I will spend considerable time making up the deficit." I said, "That sounds like a plan." We worked in the study until 10. She explained 3 things I had not known about the organization's Eastern Territory situation, and I explained 2 things about the account structure that she had not seen from her position, and both of us treated this as the ordinary, continuing work of 2 people who were good at what they did and happened to also be in the same room. Which was what it was. The ordinary and the other thing, coexisting in the amber light, no longer requiring one to hide the other. The next family dinner was in January. First Monday of the quarter, as always. I wore dark clothes and went early to help Julia with the seating arrangement, which was a role I had not previously played, and which Julia accepted with the particular composure of a woman who had expected this development and had already planned for it. The table held 30. The household staff moved through the setup with the practiced choreography of many repetitions. The specific smell of the kitchen was already in the air, garlic and rosemary, and the good red wine that went with the first course. Julia placed me at Vittoria's right hand. Not her lap. Her right hand, the seat of the consigliere. Though Julia would continue in that role, the designation was its own kind of statement, its own kind of declaration, the kind that did not require explanation to 30 people who had been in this organization long enough to read it precisely. The new underboss, a woman named Rosetta Villani, 40, calm, capable, and the specific kind of loyal that the organization had been built on, took the seat across. She looked at me when I sat down. She nodded once, the professional acknowledgement of one woman to another in a room that required professional acknowledgement, and then she looked at the table. Vittoria arrived at the head of the table in dark silk, pinned hair, the watch on her right wrist, and the bone-handled knife set to the right of her plate. She looked at the room. The room recalibrated, the way it always recalibrated when she entered it. She sat. She looked at me. The look was the one that had no professional frame and had never had one and was no longer pretending to have one. In front of 30 people and the household staff and the full assembled body of the Lanza organization's leadership, she looked at me with the thing she had been managing since January of the previous year, and she let it be visible, and it did not cost her anything. That was the thing I had not understood. In October, when I sat in her lap at this same table with the knife in her hand and the room holding its breath around us. I had thought the visibility was the cost. I had thought that what she was managing was the danger of being seen. The visibility was not the cost. The not saying was the cost. The managing was the cost. The frame was the cost. Being seen was free. I looked back at her across the head of the table in January, with the first course arriving, and the room breathing around us, and 30 years of this organization's history, in the walls and the future being, as it always was, entirely open, and entirely unmapped, and entirely the thing that came next. She picked up the knife. She cut something. She set the knife down. She said, quietly, to me and no one else, "The lamb is excellent this quarter." I said, "I know. I helped choose it." She looked at me with the full corner of her mouth, and I collected it and added it to the count and thought about the specific absurdity and rightness of sitting at this table in January, knowing that the most controlled woman I had ever encountered had been in significant difficulty since the previous January, and had said so, finally, at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in a city apartment, while wearing a coat she was afraid to take off. I thought about the tree line outside the east wing window, bare now in winter, waiting for what came after. I thought about November mornings in the city, and the light through the coffee shop windows, and the sound of her voice in the evenings when the calls became longer than the organizational business required. I thought about the study at 4 in the morning and the amber lamp and the question of whether the patience of 7 months had been worth it. There was no version of the accounting in which it had not been. Julia caught my eye from her seat down the table. She looked at the head of the table and then at me. She raised her wineglass by half an inch. I raised mine. The dinner continued. The family around us ate and talked and carried the specific warmth of people who knew each other through obligation and had discovered, over time, that obligation and affection were not mutually exclusive. The household staff moved through the room with the quiet choreography of people who had done this many times and knew all the rhythms. Outside the tall windows, the January night was doing what January nights do on the coast, which is be dark and cold and entirely unconcerned with what was happening at any specific table inside any specific room. At some point during the second course, Victoria's hand settled on the table near mine. Not holding, just near. The specific proximity that is not accidental and is not yet the whole thing, but is a declaration in the language of two people who have learned to read each other's millimeters. I did not move my hand. Neither did she. The family dinner went on around us, and the knife was on the table, and the wine was what it always was, and the room breathed, and outside the winter was being winter, and inside the light was the same amber it had always been, and two women sat at the head of a table that belonged to one of them, and held the specific, patient, hard-won possibility of what came next, which was, it turned out, everything.